The summer of 1848 was marked by a quiet, creeping dread that descended upon one of Savannah's most prominent households. Before we begin, please leave a comment with where you are watching and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We'd like to know where these documented accounts take place and when they happen. The events I am about to relate have been pieced together from courthouse records, church registries, personal letters, newspaper clippings, and the oral testimonies that survived long enough to be recorded by university researchers in the 1960 seconds. What makes this account so particularly disturbing is not the brutality or the bloodshed, though there was certainly enough of that, but rather the methodical, patient, and almost silent manner in which vengeance was exacted. The Sterlingwood estate stood 3 miles north of Savannah proper, a grand Palladian mansion nestled among sprawling, ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. These mossy tendrils seemed to whisper secrets to one another whenever the coastal winds swept in from the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt and decay. The main house, with its imposing white columns and symmetrical wings, overlooked the Savannah River, a constant, muddy procession of merchant ships passing to and from the bustling harbor. It was a picture of serene, orderly prosperity, a testament to the wealth and power of the family that resided within. And it was in this house that Amelia Sterling, the young and beautiful wife of the prominent attorney Harrison Sterling, began to experience the first symptoms of what would later be described in a coroner's report as a wasting malady of mysterious origin. But to understand what truly happened during those humid, oppressive summer months, we must first step back and examine the household as it existed before death began its quiet, methodical harvest. The Sterlingwood plantation, passed down through 4 generations of the Sterling family, had amassed a considerable fortune through the cultivation of rice, a notoriously brutal and labor-intensive crop. The wealth of the estate was built on the backs of more than 70 enslaved individuals, whose lives were as regimented and as expendable as the grains of rice they planted and harvested in the sweltering, disease-ridden, low country. Harrison Sterling had inherited the estate from his father at the age of 25, and through a combination of shrewd business dealings and his extensive connections within Savannah's elite society, had expanded both the property and its operations. He was a man known for his sharp mind, his ambition, and a certain coldness that many of his peers mistook for strength. Amelia Sterling, born Amelia Davenport, came from an equally prominent, though perhaps less wealthy, Savannah family. Their marriage in 1839 had been a grand social event, celebrated with one of the most lavish weddings the city had seen that decade. It was a union designed to consolidate power and wealth, a strategic alliance between 2 of the oldest and most respected families in the area. The marriage had produced 3 children: Thomas, a serious and quiet boy of 8, Clara, a bright and inquisitive girl of 6, and the infant James, born in January of 1848. To all outward appearances, the Sterlings embodied the pinnacle of antebellum Southern prosperity. They were wealthy, well-connected, and seemingly blessed with a perfect, beautiful family. Their home was a model of elegance and order, maintained by a large staff of enslaved domestics who moved through the grand rooms with a silent, practiced efficiency. Among them was Esther, the head house servant, who had been with the family since Harrison's childhood and whose loyalty was considered absolute. There was Samuel, the stable master, a man whose skill with horses was renowned throughout the county. There was Delia, the children's nurse, a gentle, patient woman who doted on her young charges. And there was a young woman named Cora, who had been purchased from a neighboring plantation 2 years prior to serve as Amelia's personal attendant, a role that required her to be a constant, silent presence in her mistress's life. But it was another woman, Elspeth, who held the most unusual and, ultimately, the most powerful position within the household hierarchy. Elspeth, who had been born into slavery on the Sterlingwood plantation some 40 years earlier, served as the family's midwife. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman from the Gullah region, a woman who had carried with her from Africa a deep and ancient knowledge of herbs, roots, and the hidden properties of the natural world. Elspeth had inherited this knowledge, and her skills as a healer and a midwife were so valued that Harrison's own father had permitted her to keep a small, secluded garden behind the kitchen house, where she grew a variety of medicinal plants. What was not widely known, however, was the depth of Elspeth's connection to the Sterling family. She had not only assisted in the births of countless children on the plantation, both enslaved and free, but she had also delivered Harrison Sterling himself some 37 years earlier. She had been present at the birth of each of his siblings, and she had brought all three of his own children into the world. In a society rigidly stratified by race, Elspeth occupied that rare, liminal space of being simultaneously essential and invisible. She moved through the household with a quiet efficiency, her presence so familiar that the Sterlings hardly registered it at all. They saw her as a fixture, a part of the house itself, as dependable and as unremarkable as the grandfather clock in the hall. They did not see the woman behind the role, the memories she carried, or the slow, patient anger that had been simmering within her for decades. The events that would ultimately shatter this carefully constructed world of privilege and power began innocuously enough in March of 1848, approximately 2 months after the birth of James, the Sterlings' youngest child. Amelia, who had always been a vibrant and energetic woman, began to complain of a persistent fatigue, a weariness that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. She suffered from headaches and occasional bouts of stomach discomfort, which were initially dismissed by everyone, including Amelia herself, as the natural and expected consequences of childbirth. But as spring progressed into the hot, humid days of early summer, her symptoms gradually worsened. By early May, she had developed a peculiar, waxy pallor, her skin losing its healthy, youthful glow. She had also lost a noticeable amount of weight, her once robust figure becoming frail and gaunt. Her friends and family commented on her changed appearance with concern, but no one suspected anything more than a difficult recovery from her recent pregnancy. Dr. Alistair Finch, the family physician who had attended the Sterlings for years, was summoned to the estate. A respected, if somewhat old-fashioned, practitioner, Dr. Finch prescribed a tonic of iron and quinine, suspecting a case of malaria, a disease that was not uncommon in the low-lying, mosquito-infested areas surrounding Savannah. The tonic, however, provided no relief. If anything, Amelia's condition seemed to deteriorate more rapidly after she began taking it. Her once healthy appetite diminished until she could barely manage a few spoonfuls of broth at each meal. Her strength ebbed so dramatically that by June, she could no longer leave her bedchamber without assistance. The vibrant young woman who had once managed her household with a mixture of precision and grace became a ghost of her former self, a pale, listless figure confined to a sickbed with the curtains drawn against the harsh summer light. Dr. Finch, increasingly perplexed and concerned, visited with growing frequency. As the weeks passed, and Amelia's condition continued to decline, he resorted to the standard, often brutal, treatments of the era. He applied leeches to her temples and wrists, hoping to draw out what he believed might be bad blood causing her illness. He administered various preparations of mercury, arsenic, and bismuth, powerful, toxic substances that were used to treat a wide range of ailments, often with devastating side effects. But nothing alleviated Amelia's suffering. In fact, each new treatment seemed to only accelerate her decline, her body racked with pain and nausea, her mind clouded with a strange, persistent confusion. By early July, the entire household revolved around the sick room. The normal rhythms of plantation life were disrupted by the constant, hushed activity surrounding the dying mistress. Servants rushed in and out of her bedchamber with fresh linens, cool water, and whatever small amount of nourishment Amelia could be persuaded to take. Harrison, his face etched with a mixture of grief and frustration, spent hours at his wife's bedside, a silent, helpless witness to her slow, inexplicable decline. Throughout this ordeal, Elspeth, the midwife, remained a quiet, unobtrusive presence in the background. She would occasionally prepare herbal teas, which she claimed would settle the stomach or reduce fever. She moved silently through the house, her face a mask of calm concern, observing everything while appearing to observe nothing at all. If anyone had been paying closer attention, They might have noticed that Elspeth always seemed to be present when Dr. Finch discussed Amelia's condition with Harrison, or when the kitchen staff prepared the invalid's meals. They might have seen the way her eyes lingered on the medicine bottles, or the careful, deliberate way she measured the herbs for her teas. But in a household accustomed to treating its enslaved individuals as part of the furniture, present but unseen, no one remarked on Elspeth's quiet, watchful vigilance. They saw only the faithful servant, the trusted healer, doing what she had always done. On the morning of July 23rd, 1848, Amelia Sterling died in her bed. She was 29 years old. The official cause of death, as recorded by a frustrated and bewildered Dr. Finch, was wasting illness of unknown origin. It was a frustratingly vague diagnosis, one that provided no answers and no closure for her grieving husband and 3 motherless children. The funeral, held 2 days later at Christ Church Episcopal in Savannah, was a grand, somber affair, attended by nearly every prominent family in the city. Amelia was interred in the Sterling family plot at Laurel Grove Cemetery, her grave marked by an elaborate monument, a weeping angel carved from white marble imported from Italy. The newspapers eulogized her as a paragon of Southern womanhood, a devoted wife and mother whose tragic, untimely death was a loss to the entire community. Life at Sterlingwood attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy following the funeral. Harrison threw himself into his legal practice with a renewed, almost frantic vigor, often not returning home until well after his children had been put to bed. The house settled into the peculiar, heavy quiet that follows in the wake of tragedy, a silence that seems to have its own weight and substance. The memory of Amelia, the ghost of her suffering, lingered in every room. It was approximately 3 weeks after Amelia's funeral that the true horror began to unfold. Harrison himself began to exhibit the same chilling symptoms that had afflicted his wife. The headaches came first, sharp and persistent, followed by bouts of nausea and a gradually increasing weakness that left him struggling to get through the day. Initially, he attributed these symptoms to grief and overwork, a physical manifestation of his emotional distress. But as August progressed and his condition worsened, a terrible, familiar dread began to take hold. Dr. Finch was once again summoned to the Sterling estate. The doctor's concern was evident from the moment he examined Harrison. The similarity to Amelia's illness was too striking, too precise, to be a mere coincidence. Once again, various treatments were prescribed: tonics, purgatives, bloodletting, and once again, they provided no relief. By early September, Harrison Sterling, one of the most powerful and respected men in Savannah, was confined to the same bed in which his wife had died just weeks earlier. His skin had taken on a sickly, yellowish tinge, and he suffered from violent stomach cramps that left him drenched in sweat and barely conscious. The grand house, once a symbol of his success and security, had become a prison, a place of suffering and fear. Throughout the household, whispers of a possible contagion began to circulate among the servants. Was there some miasma, some deadly fever that had taken root in the house? Dr. Finch, however, remained skeptical. Contagious illnesses typically spread more rapidly and more widely. Yet, just as with Amelia's illness, none of the children, nor any of the other house servants, had shown any similar symptoms. The illness seemed to be targeting only the master and mistress of the house. Something else was at work here, something more targeted, more deliberate, and infinitely more sinister. It was Cora, the young woman who had previously served as Amelia's personal attendant, who first voiced the suspicion that would eventually unravel everything. Quiet and observant by nature, Cora had been a near constant presence in the sick room during her mistress's final months. She had seen firsthand the progression of the illness, the failure of every treatment, and the slow, agonizing decline. Now, watching the same pattern repeat itself in Harrison, she began to notice small details that others had overlooked. One evening in mid-September, as Harrison's condition continued to deteriorate, she approached Samuel, the stable master, her face a mask of fear. "I've seen Elspeth adding something to the master's tea," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the main house. A powder that she keeps in a small cloth pouch tied at her waist. She does it when she thinks no one is watching, just before she takes the tray up to his room. Samuel, a man who had served the Sterling family his entire life, initially dismissed Cora's concerns. Elspeth had been a fixture at Sterlingwood for decades. Her loyalty was considered as solid and as dependable as the ancient oaks that lined the driveway. Besides, she was a healer, not a poisoner. It was natural that she would prepare medicinal teas for an ailing member of the household, but Cora was insistent. "It's the same tea she used to make for Mistress Amelia," she continued, her voice trembling. "And I've seen her collecting leaves and roots from the swamp edge, from places beyond her garden, plants I've never seen her use before, plants the other women whisper about." Reluctantly, Samuel agreed to watch Elspeth more closely, though he did so mainly to appease the frightened young woman rather than out of any genuine suspicion. 3 days of careful, covert observation, however, confirmed Cora's account. He saw Elspeth, on 2 separate occasions, adding a grayish powder to Harrison's tea, a substance she carefully measured from a pouch kept hidden beneath the folds of her apron. Unsure of how to proceed, and terrified of the implications of what he had seen, Samuel finally approached Esther, the eldest of the house servants. Esther had been at Sterlingwood longer than anyone. She had been a young woman when Harrison's father was a boy. Her judgment was respected, her silence valued. Samuel recounted what he and Cora had witnessed, his voice low and urgent. Esther listened without interruption, her weathered face betraying no emotion. When he had finished, she remained silent for several long moments, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of the main house. "There are things about Elspeth that you don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things that happened long before you came to this plantation. Old sins that have cast a long shadow." What Esther revealed that night would later be recorded in a deposition given to Savannah authorities, a document so explosive that it was sealed by court order and hidden from public view for more than 20 years. According to Esther's account, Elspeth had given birth to a daughter some 20 years earlier. The child's father was not an enslaved man from the quarters, but William Harrison Sterling, Sr., the current master's father. The infant girl, born with skin the color of cream and her father's unmistakable green eyes, had been a living, breathing testament to the master's hypocrisy and a constant, silent accusation to his white family. Despite Elspeth's desperate pleas, the child had been sold to a plantation in Alabama when she was just 3 years old, sent away to erase the evidence of the old master's transgression. Elspeth was never the same after that, Esther explained, her voice heavy with the weight of old grief. She continued her duties as midwife. She delivered the current master himself and all his brothers and sisters. She smiled and served and kept her head down. But something in her eyes changed. Something died that day, and something else, something cold and hard, was born in its place. The reason for Elspeth's apparent targeting of Amelia, however, remained a mystery until Esther revealed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Shortly after Harrison and Amelia's marriage, in 1839, a letter had arrived from Alabama, addressed to the elder Mr. Sterling. The letter, which Esther had glimpsed while dusting the study, contained news that Elspeth's daughter had died under circumstances described only as suspicious. The girl, by then a young woman of 16, had been working as a house servant in the home of a wealthy family, a family related to the Davenports, Amelia's family. "I believe Elspeth has been waiting all these years," Esther concluded, her voice trembling with the enormity of the revelation, "waiting for the perfect moment to exact her revenge on both families. The Sterlings, who took her child, and the Davenports, who she blames for her daughter's death. And what more perfect revenge than to destroy their bloodlines, just as they had destroyed hers?" Armed with this terrible knowledge, Samuel and Esther now understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The next day, they secretly observed Elspeth preparing the morning's meals. They watched in horror as she added the mysterious powder not only to Harrison's tea, but also to the milk prepared for the infant, James. Realizing they could wait no longer, they intercepted the contaminated beverages, replacing them with unaltered versions. That night, while Elspeth was assisting Dr. Finch with Harrison's evening treatment, they searched her small, isolated cabin at the edge of the slave quarters. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they found what they were looking for: a collection of small cloth pouches containing various powders and dried plant materials. They also found a journal, written in a mixture of English and Gula, that served as a chilling record of Elspeth's long, patient quest for vengeance. The journal detailed the progressive symptoms of arsenic poisoning and recorded, with a terrifyingly clinical precision, the declining health of both Amelia and Harrison. Most damning of all, they discovered a lock of light brown hair, tied with a faded blue ribbon, the only tangible memory Elspeth had of her lost daughter. The evidence was taken directly to Dr. Finch, the old physician, who had been struggling for months understand the mysterious illness that had claimed one of his patients and was now threatening another, was initially skeptical. But upon examining the powders, he confirmed the presence of arsenic, as well as several other highly toxic substances derived from plants not native to the Savannah area. The carefully constructed facade of natural illness shattered, revealing the horrifying truth of a deliberate, methodical poisoning. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, authorities were summoned to the Sterlingwood Plantation on the morning of September 20th, 1848. Elspeth was arrested without resistance in the garden where she had cultivated the very instruments of her revenge. Her expression, as the deputies led her away, betrayed neither surprise nor remorse. She simply looked back at the grand house one last time, her gaze lingering on the windows of the nursery, before she was placed in the wagon and taken to Savannah to face justice. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in antebellum Savannah. Held in October of 1848, it drew spectators from throughout the region, all eager to catch a glimpse of the enslaved woman accused of poisoning one of the city's most prominent families. Elspeth, denied legal representation as was typical for enslaved individuals accused of crimes against white citizens, stood silently as a parade of witnesses recounted the evidence against her. Dr. Finch testified that Harrison Sterling was now slowly recovering, his symptoms having abated once the source of the poisoning had been removed. Cora and Samuel described their observations of Elspeth's suspicious behavior, and Esther, her voice heavy with a grief that seemed to encompass more than just the recent tragedies, revealed the painful history of a stolen child and a mother's broken heart, the story that had presumably motivated Elspeth's terrible actions. When asked by the judge if she wished to speak in her own defense, Elspeth broke her silence for the first and only time during the proceedings. Her words, recorded by the court clerk and preserved in the trial transcript, were delivered in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the crowded courtroom. "I brought them into this world," she said, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's bench. "It was fitting that I should usher them out. What was taken from me cannot be restored. What I have taken cannot be undone. There is a balance in all things." The jury, composed entirely of white male landowners, deliberated for less than an hour before delivering a guilty verdict. On November 2nd, 1848, Elspeth was executed by hanging in the yard of the Savannah workhouse, the first and only time a female slave convicted of poisoning was publicly executed in the city. According to newspaper accounts of the day, she maintained her composure until the very end, meeting her death with the same quiet, unsettling dignity that had characterized her life. In the aftermath of the trial, life at Sterlingwood was irrevocably changed. Harrison Sterling made a remarkable physical recovery, but the psychological scars of the ordeal never healed. He lived for another 11 years, a ghost in his own home, haunted by the memory of his wife and the terrible secret of his family's past. He became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving the plantation, his once thriving legal practice abandoned. He died of pneumonia in 1859 at the age of 46, a man broken by a vengeance that had reached out from beyond the grave. His 3 children, who had been sent to live with relatives in Charleston during the trial and its aftermath, survived to adulthood. But the shadow of their family's tragedy followed them. Thomas, the eldest, inherited the plantation, but, finding the memories it held too painful, sold it in 1871 and moved to Baltimore, severing his ties with the South. Clara, the daughter, married a northern businessman and relocated to Philadelphia after the Civil War, a city that had been a center of the abolitionist movement. And James, the infant who had so narrowly escaped being Elspeth's third victim, became a physician, dedicating his life to the study of toxicology, perhaps in an attempt to understand the forces that had so nearly claimed his own life. The sterlingwood plantation itself, once a symbol of Southern prosperity, was eventually divided and sold off in parcels following the economic hardships of the Reconstruction era. The grand house survived until 1894, when it was destroyed in a fire of unknown origin. Archaeological excavations conducted at the site in 1965 uncovered the foundations of the house, as well as several smaller structures, including what was believed to be Elspeth's cabin. Among the artifacts recovered was a small blue glass bottle containing traces of what later analysis identified as arsenic, combined with several plant toxins. What makes this case so particularly haunting is not merely the calculated nature of Elspeth's revenge, but the systems of power and oppression that created the conditions for such a tragedy. Elspeth, separated from her child and denied any legal recourse for the injustices inflicted upon her, found her power in the only realm available to her: the ancient knowledge of herbs and medicines passed down through generations of women. In a world that sought to render her powerless, she turned the very tools of healing into instruments of a terrible, slow-burning justice. The story is a chilling reminder that in a system built on fundamental injustice, vengeance, when denied all other channels, may find its way through the most intimate acts of daily life. The Sterling poisoning case, though a sensation at the time, quickly faded from public memory as the nation lurched toward the cataclysm of the Civil War. The story was too uncomfortable, its implications too disturbing. It was easier to forget, to bury the dominant tale of the enslaved midwife and her terrible revenge beneath the more glorious and romanticized myths of the Old South. The court records were sealed, the newspaper accounts were filed away, and the oral histories were confined to the hushed conversations of the enslaved and, later, the free black communities of Savannah. The story resurfaced briefly in 1962 when a young historian named Margaret Johnston, researching a book on women in antebellum Charleston and Savannah, discovered the sealed court records in a dusty corner of the courthouse archives. Intrigued, she began to piece together the fragmented narrative, tracking down old newspaper accounts and, most importantly, conducting interviews with the elderly descendants of those who had lived and worked on the sterlingwood plantation. Her notes, deposited in the University of South Carolina archives, were a treasure trove of lost history, a detailed reconstruction of the events of 1848. Tragically, Johnston's notes were lost during a building renovation in 1968, and the court documents themselves were reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire the following year. All that remains now are fragments. A few surviving newspaper clippings, entries in church death registers, passing references in personal correspondence from the period, and the second-hand accounts of the oral histories Johnston had collected before her work was lost. From these scattered pieces, we have attempted to reconstruct this dark chapter in Savannah's history, a story that speaks to the complex and often terrible relationships between the enslaved and their enslavers, between those who held power and those who found ways to subvert it. Today, the land where the sterlingwood plantation once stood has been reclaimed by forest and underbrush. No marker indicates the site of the main house or the small cabin where Elspeth mixed her deadly potions. The graves of Amelia and Harrison Sterling can still be found in Laurel Grove Cemetery, their headstones weathered but legible, their story reduced to a name and 2 dates. Elspeth's final resting place, like those of most enslaved individuals, remains unmarked and unknown, her body likely buried in an anonymous potter's field. But according to local lore, the story of Elspeth and the Sterlings has not entirely disappeared. On certain nights, when the moon is new and the Spanish moss hangs especially still in the humid air, Visitors to the area have reported the faint scent of herbs on the breeze, rosemary, thyme, and something sharper, more metallic. Some claim to have heard the soft, rhythmic grinding of leaves being reduced to powder, the quiet murmuring of a woman's voice reciting formulas in a language no longer spoken, and in the oldest families of Savannah, there persists an unspoken fear of certain teas, certain preparations, certain combinations of herbs that might, in the wrong hands, become instruments of a justice too long denied. In the years following Elspeth's execution, several other cases of suspected poisoning by enslaved individuals were reported throughout the Carolinas and Georgia. None were prosecuted as vigorously or documented as thoroughly as the Sterling case, but they point to a hidden undercurrent of resistance, a form of chemical warfare waged by the powerless against their oppressors. Perhaps most telling is an amendment to Georgia law passed in 1850, specifically prohibiting enslaved people from growing or possessing certain plants known to have medicinal or toxic properties, a legal acknowledgement of the fear that had taken root in the minds of the planter class. The story of Elspeth and the Sterling family serves as a chilling reminder that vengeance, when denied all other channels, may flow through the most intimate acts of daily life. The preparation of food and drink, the tending of the sick, the bringing forth of new life. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it may appear, is never complete, and that those deemed powerless often find and forge their own terrible weapons. As for the other key figures in this tragedy, their fates are a patchwork of recorded facts and historical silence. Cora, the young woman whose observations led to Elspeth's arrest, was sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849. Her fate after that point is unknown. Samuel, the stable master, remained at the Sterlingwood plantation until emancipation, after which he established a small livery stable in Savannah. Esther, the elderly house servant who held the key to the entire mystery, lived to see freedom as well, dying in 1872 at the estimated age of 85. In her final years, she reportedly refused to speak of Elspeth or the events of 1848, turning away whenever the subject was raised, the memories too painful to revisit. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is the question it leaves us with. In a system built on fundamental injustice, where can true justice ever be found? Elspeth's actions, while horrifying, emerged from a lifetime of suffering that few of us today can fully comprehend. The legal execution that ended her life represented the enforcement of laws designed to protect the very system that had destroyed her family. There are no heroes in this story, only victims of varying degrees, all caught in the grinding machinery of an institution that corrupted everything it touched. The poisoned bloodline of the Sterlings and the Davenports did not end with Harrison's recovery. According to correspondence found in the 1882, descendants of both families continued to suffer from a range of mysterious ailments, often exhibiting symptoms similar to those experienced by Amelia and Harrison. Medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to determine whether these later cases represented the long-term, hereditary effects of the initial poisoning, a genetic susceptibility to certain diseases, or perhaps the power of suggestion at work in families haunted by their own dark history. What we do know is that by 1900, both the Sterling and Davenport family lines had dwindled significantly, with many branches ending in childlessness or early death. Whether this represents the final, chilling fulfillment of Elspeth's curse, or simply the natural entropy of family lineages over time, is impossible to determine. But in the whispered stories passed down through generations of Savannah's oldest families, the name Elspeth still carries a weight of dread, a cautionary tale of a vengeance that reached beyond death itself to claim its due. The land where the Sterlingwood plantation once stood remains strangely resistant to development. Multiple attempts throughout the 20th century to build on the property were abandoned after encountering unexplained difficulties, equipment failures, worker illnesses, sudden financial setbacks. Local superstition holds that the ground itself has been tainted, poisoned, not by arsenic or herbs, but by the weight of history and unresolved injustice. In 1969, during the last archaeological survey of the site before it was reclaimed by wilderness, researchers discovered something unexpected beneath the remains of Elspeth's cabin, a small bundle wrapped in faded blue cloth, containing the skeletal remains of an infant. Forensic analysis suggested the child had died at or shortly after birth. No record exists of Elspeth having a second child, and the age of the remains indicated a burial sometime around 1,824 or 1,825 years before the events that would later unfold. Was this another loss that fueled Elspeth's decades-long quest for vengeance? Another child taken from her, this time by natural causes rather than human cruelty? The records are silent on this point, and the remains themselves were reinterred without ceremony at the insistence of local community leaders, another secret buried beneath the soil. And so, the story of the enslaved midwife who poisoned her mistress's bloodline enters the realm of history and folklore, a dark thread in the complex tapestry of America's past. It reminds us that beneath the romanticized vision of the antebellum South lies a reality far more complex and disturbing, a reality in which power and resistance, love and hate, life and death were intimately intertwined in ways that continue to haunt us to this day. If you find yourself in Savannah, walking the historic streets or visiting the old cemeteries where generations of the city's elite lie buried in ornate tombs, listen carefully to the stories told by tour guides and local historians. You may hear sanitized versions of Elspeth's story, often presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers faced by the plantation aristocracy. What you are less likely to hear is the fuller truth, that Elspeth's actions, however terrible, represented one woman's desperate attempt to balance scales that the society of her time had deliberately and violently weighted against her. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Elspeth and her victims is not a monument or a marker, but the uneasy silence that still surrounds certain aspects of our shared past. A silence that, when broken, reveals stories we are still struggling to fully hear and understand. Like a poison working its way through a bloodline, the effects of our history continue to manifest in ways both visible and invisible, challenging us to confront the complex legacy of those who came before us and the systems they created and resisted. As the sun sets over the marshes and rivers surrounding Savannah, as the ancient oak trees cast their lengthening shadows across landscapes both changed and unchanged by time, the story of Elspeth and the Sterlings whispers still. A reminder that beneath the surface of even the most ordered society lie currents of rage and resistance, love and loss, that may emerge when we least expect them, altering forever the course of individual lives and collective histories. The final records concerning the Sterling case were reportedly sealed in the state archives in Columbia, South Carolina, in 1971, deemed too sensitive or potentially inflammatory for public access. Whether they still exist or have been lost to time, like so many other documents from that period, remains unknown. But in the absence of official histories, the story continues to be passed down through generations, changing subtly with each telling, yet retaining its essential, chilling truth, that in a world where justice is denied, vengeance may become a terrible substitute, exacting costs that echo across decades and centuries. In 2004, during renovations to an old building in downtown Savannah that had once housed the law firm where Harrison Sterling had worked, construction workers discovered a hidden compartment within a wall. Inside was a small wooden box containing what appeared to be personal effects: a tarnished silver locket, a folded piece of yellowed paper, and a small vial of dark liquid. The building's owner, recognizing the potential historical significance of the find, donated the items to the Savannah History Museum. Analysis of the contents revealed something extraordinary. The locket contained a lock of hair, 2 strands intertwined, one dark, one light brown. DNA testing, though limited due to the age of the samples, suggested a close familial relationship. The folded paper, carefully preserved, was a bill of sale for a mulatto female child, aged 3 years, sound in body and mind. The child's name was listed as Sarah. The buyer was a representative of the Davenport family of Alabama, relatives of the woman who would later become Amelia Sterling. The seller was identified as William Harrison Sterling, Sr. The vial, when analyzed by forensic chemists, was found to contain traces of a complex mixture of arsenic, belladonna, and several plant compounds known to cause symptoms similar to those experienced by Amelia and Harrison Sterling in 1848. Residue analysis suggested the mixture was at least 150 years old. These discoveries prompted a renewed interest in the Sterling poisoning case among historians and archaeologists. In 2007, a team from the University of South Carolina obtained permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar studies of the former Sterlingwood plantation site. They discovered not only the foundations of the main house and outbuildings, but also evidence of a previously unknown structure located approximately 50 yards from Elspeth's cabin. Careful excavation revealed the remains of what appeared to be a small dwelling, more rudimentary than the other slave quarters on the property. Carbon dating of artifacts suggested it had been occupied sometime between 1820 and 1825. The period when, according to the fragmentary historical record, Elspeth would have been pregnant with and given birth to her daughter. Most significant among the findings was a small clay pot buried beneath the packed earth floor. Inside were several items: a child's tooth wrapped in cloth, 3 glass beads of European manufacture, and a small wooden doll with features carved in a style consistent with West African traditions. Anthropologists familiar with Gullah Geechee cultural practices identified these as consistent with protective charms, often created for children. These discoveries painted a more nuanced picture of Elspeth's life before the events that would lead to her execution. They suggested that she had indeed given birth to a child fathered by the old master, that she had attempted to protect this child through both practical and spiritual means, and that, despite these efforts, the child had been sold to relatives of the Davenport family at the age of 3. Further research in previously unexplored archives brought to light a series of letters exchanged between members of the Davenport family in Alabama and their relatives in Savannah during the years 1840 to 1843. These letters, part of a private collection, contained references to a troublesome mulatto servant girl who had been punished repeatedly for insubordination. One letter, dated November 1842, mentioned that the girl had been put in her place after attempting to run away and that measures had been taken to ensure she would cause no further difficulty. The final letter in the series, dated January 1843, noted simply that the problem has been permanently resolved and that the writer was seeking a replacement house servant. No further mention of the girl appeared in subsequent correspondence. This timing aligns precisely with Esther's testimony that news of Elspeth's daughter's death under suspicious circumstances had reached Savannah shortly before Harrison and Amelia's marriage. These discoveries paint a more complete picture of the events that may have motivated Elspeth's actions. Her daughter, taken from her at a young age and sold to relatives of the woman who would later marry into the Sterling family, had apparently died under circumstances that suggested mistreatment or violence. Elspeth, powerless to protect her child or seek justice through any official channels, had waited patiently for years, cultivating her knowledge of herbs and poisons, positioning herself as the trusted midwife who would deliver the children of the very families responsible for her loss. The calculated nature of her revenge becomes even more apparent when we consider that she waited until after Amelia had given birth to her 3rd child before beginning the poisoning. Elspeth ensured that the bloodlines would continue, just enough to create the maximum possible suffering. Parents would live to see their children grow, form attachments, and then watch them suffer and die. It was not merely death she sought to inflict, but the same prolonged anguish she herself had endured. In 2011, an unexpected source provided further insight. A descendant of Esther, the house servant whose testimony had been crucial in Elspeth's conviction, came forward with a family document that had been preserved through generations. The document, written in 1872 shortly before Esther's death, contained her full account of the events of 1848, including details that had not been part of her official testimony. According to this account, Esther had been aware of Elspeth's actions for some time before she revealed them. She had observed Elspeth collecting plants from the marshes, had noticed the careful way she prepared certain teas, and had recognized the gradual decline in Amelia's health as something other than natural illness. Yet she had remained silent, caught in the impossible position of divided loyalties to the Sterling family who owned her, to Elspeth who had been her friend for decades, and to her own conscience. What finally prompted Esther to act, according to her written account, was not concern for Harrison's life, but fear for the children, particularly the infant James. "I could not stand by and watch a babe suffer for the sins of its father and grandfather," she wrote. "Elspeth's vengeance had justice in it, but the children were innocent, and I could not bear their deaths on my conscience." Esther's account also revealed that Elspeth had confided in her about the full extent of her plan, not merely to kill Amelia and Harrison, but to systematically poison every member of both the Sterling and Davenport families within her reach. She had apparently maintained correspondence with other enslaved people in households connected to both families and had shared her knowledge of poisons with them. Her plan was to erase both bloodlines from the earth, Esther wrote, as they had tried to erase her daughter. Whether Elspeth succeeded in this broader aim is difficult to determine. Historical records do show that in the decades following her execution, both the Sterling and Davenport families experienced unusual rates of unexplained illnesses, infertility, and early deaths. By 1900, as previously noted, both family lines had diminished significantly. Was this the result of Elspeth's poisoning reaching across generations, or simply the consequence of the Civil War, economic changes, and the natural dispersal of family lines over time? The historical record cannot provide a definitive answer. What is clear, however, is that Elspeth's story represents far more than a simple case of murder or revenge. It embodies the complex moral universe of American slavery, where conventional notions of justice, loyalty, and morality were distorted beyond recognition. In a system where human beings were legally property, where families could be separated on a slaveholder's whim, where sexual exploitation was routine and unquestioned, conventional moral frameworks simply could not contain the depths of human experience and response. In 2015, the Savannah City Council debated a proposal to include Elspeth's story in the official historical tours of the city. After heated discussion, the proposal was rejected on the grounds that it might cast the city's history in an unnecessarily negative light and focus on divisions rather than reconciliation. This decision itself becomes part of the ongoing narrative, the ways in which certain histories continue to be marginalized or silenced in service of more comfortable narratives. Yet, despite official reluctance, Elspeth's story has continued to circulate through other channels. Local tour guides who specialize in the darker aspects of Savannah's history include versions of it in their nighttime tours. Community theater groups have staged dramatic interpretations. Writers and artists have found inspiration in this tale of power, resistance, and revenge. The story refuses to disappear, perhaps because it speaks to something essential about America's troubled relationship with its own past. In 2019, during an unusually severe hurricane that struck the Georgia coast, flooding revealed something long buried on the former sterlingwood plantation property. As the waters receded, local residents noticed unusual formations in the soil of an area that had been underwater for generations, the outlines of what appeared to be a garden, perfectly preserved beneath layers of sediment. Botanical archaeologists from Clemson University excavated the site and identified the remnants of numerous medicinal and poisonous plants, many of which were not native to the region but would have been known to someone with knowledge of African herbal traditions. The garden's location corresponded exactly with historical descriptions of Elspeth's medicinal garden. Analysis of soil samples indicated the continuous cultivation of certain toxic plants for at least 20 years prior to 1848, suggesting that Elspeth's plan had been in development far longer than anyone had suspected. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a small stone marker buried at the center of the garden. Carved into its surface was a simple symbol, a circle with a line drawn through it, identified by cultural anthropologists as a symbol associated with certain West African traditions related to justice and the balancing of debts. The stone was determined to have been placed there sometime around 1825. the year Elspeth's daughter was sold away from the plantation. These discoveries suggest that Elspeth's vengeance was not a sudden decision born of passion or desperation, but a carefully orchestrated plan, developed and refined over decades. She had cultivated both her plants and her patience, waiting for the perfect moment to exact a revenge that would mirror the suffering she had endured. The slow, agonizing loss of family, the helplessness of watching a loved one suffer without the power to intervene. As we conclude this account, we are left with questions rather than answers. What does justice look like in the wake of historical atrocities? How do we balance the need to understand the full complexity of the past with the desire for narratives that allow for healing and reconciliation? What debts remain unpaid? What accounts remain unbalanced in the ledger books of history? Elspeth's voice comes down to us only in fragments, filtered through the accounts of those who condemned her and the systems designed to silence her. Yet the power of her story persists, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and identity. In her final statement before the court, "I brought them into this world. It was fitting that I should usher them out." There is a balance in all things. We hear not just the voice of one woman driven to terrible acts by unbearable loss, but an indictment of a society that created the conditions for such tragedy. The poisoned bloodline that forms the center of this narrative extends beyond the biological descendants of the Sterling and Davenport families. It reaches into our present, into the persistent inequalities and unresolved traumas that continue to shape American society. Elspeth's story asks us to consider what poisons might still be working their way through our collective body, what antidotes might yet be discovered, and what true healing might require. As night falls over Savannah, as the ancient oak trees cast their shadows across landscapes both changed and unchanged by time, Elspeth's presence lingers, not as a simple villain or victim, but as a complex human being caught in and responding to inhuman circumstances. Her story whispers to us still, demanding to be heard in its full complexity, refusing the comfort of easy judgment or convenient forgetting. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Elspeth and all those caught in the web of this tragedy is not a monument or a marker, but the ongoing work of confronting our shared past with courage and honesty. For only by acknowledging the full weight of history, its complexities, its contradictions, its unresolved debts, can we begin to imagine a future where the poisoned bloodlines of our national origins might finally be healed.